It's a pleasure to be back here. I appreciate you all braving the terrible weather to come here, although by Wisconsin standards, this ain't nothing. It took me a while to figure out the Celsius system, but people in Melbourne in particular were complaining that the weather was cold there when it would be 15 degrees, and I would tell them in Wisconsin, in the depth of the winter, it would often get to 25 or even 30 below. It's routine. And the one notable feature of the Fahrenheit and Celsius temperature scales is that they intersect at minus 40. And that, fortunately, that has never gotten that cold in Madison while I was there. But I very much enjoy coming back to the country. I have now hit every capital in the country. I think I've traveled around Australia, certainly more than I've traveled around the United States, although you have fewer states. But the genesis of this talk comes from conversations that John and I had about what might be interesting to Australian audiences. And it also occurred to me that when I gave talks around the country, and even this trip, when I've spoken at a number of different events in a lot of high schools, there were two questions that came up almost invariably when I talked about politics in 2006. One of them was, why don't you have compulsory voting in the United States? And the other was, what is it with you people and guns? And I actually decided fairly quickly after being asked those questions that the two are actually related. And not just because that if compulsory voting were ever implemented in the United States, that there would be millions of people taking to the streets with all the guns that they've been storing. But it's a little more philosophical than that. So what I'm going to try to do is to explain my take on compulsory voting and some of the reasons why I think it is unlikely to ever be enacted in the United States. And John is right that it's taken seriously. Over the weekend, Tom Mann, who is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and the author of a very popular book in the States called It's Even Worse Than You Think, proposed compulsory voting as a solution, one solution, to the problems of polarization and low levels of engagement. Let's see, how is this? I must have turned this off. Well, there we go. So the argument for compulsory voting in the United States is that we have, particularly with respect to Australia, but also with respect to most other industrialized democracies in the world, we have low rates of participation. And this creates problems for any system of government that is premised on democratic legitimacy and majority rule, because it is routine in the US that with only about 50 to 55% of the public, of the eligible voting population taking the trouble to cast a ballot, that it's routine for governments to take office with the support of 20, even 25% would be considered a good percentage of the vote of the overall population. And we also know that turnout is significantly lower among more marginalized populations, the poor, minorities, and well, those are the people without a lot of education. And that also creates the possibility that the decisions that are rendered by the number of people who form winning majorities in our elections do not reflect the views of the true majority, that they're not representative of the views of the entire electorate. You can also make the case that voting is a civic duty, that it's an obligation, not just a right, but is something that we as citizens have the duty to perform in order to preserve the health of the democracy. And as we've seen, the president of the American Political Science Association, in his annual speech to the association in 2001, I believe, proposed compulsory voting, and there actually is quite a bit of support within the academic community for this kind of proposal. And you can see here, when I show turnout by a number of industrialized democracies, this is not all of them, but the two on the left are two of really the only two countries that have systematic compulsory voting. And you can see that in Australia and Belgium, this is from the International Democratic Education Agency, and I averaged turnout as a percentage of the eligible voting age population, not as it is more commonly calculated here as the percentage of the people who are eligible based on their enrollment. And you can see that the turnout in Australia and Belgium is above 80% in comparison to the United Kingdom, which is 59%, and the United States, which comes in dead last. And even these other countries, some of which used to have compulsory voting, that do not. I think Austria still has some in some of the jurisdictions. But you can clearly see that turnout in the United States is low, certainly compared to other industrialized democracies, and unquestionably when compared to nations that have compulsory voting. And to extend the argument a little further, that you can make a very good case that low levels of turnout have the following consequences, which could undermine the health of democratic systems. That they bestow less legitimacy on the winners, because when you can only claim the support of 25% of the eligible voters, that means that you can't really claim to have the support of a majority. Elections are less likely to reflect the true views of the majority. And so here, the basic principle of democratic legitimacy is undermined. Governments will be less responsive to marginalized populations, because if the young, the poor, minorities, those with less education don't turn out, there is no incentive for the government or national governments, state governments, however you wish to characterize it. They don't need to consider the views of people who don't vote. And that can result, in the view of people like Tom Mann of the Brookings Institution, can result in policies that give particular weight to those who are the noisiest, those who make the loudest and strongest demands on government, because if you can mobilize your supporters, you have a tremendous advantage over those groups or those policies that have less success in mobilizing their people. And this tendency to mobilize and counter-mobilize can lead to disillusionment, because it's the conventional wisdom in the United States, and it's not precisely true, but campaigns believe that it's true, that one of the ways you can keep your opponents from mobilizing their supporters is that you go negative. You run negative ads, which has a tendency to turn people off and make people disgusted with politics. And there are a number of elections where the explanation for the reason one side won or the other side won is because the campaigns were so nasty and so slimy that it just turned people off, and people chose, out of regard for their own health and well-being, that they didn't want to engage with politics. And also, that low turnout is both a cause and a consequence of low levels of engagement. When people are not engaged, political leaders, campaigns have less incentive to speak to their interests, and when candidates and campaigns don't speak to the interests of people, then people have less of an incentive to engage. So all manner of different pathologies. And I know it's not necessarily true that compulsory voting leads to complete well-being and rainbows all around, because unfortunately, Australia, you seem to have imported from the United States the divisive politics that has characterized the United States for some time. And compulsory voting as a solution to these problems, the argument is it has a number of positive benefits, that it forces elected officials to consider not just a broader set of views, but the full range of views, and that in a lot of discussions with people here, I've heard it multiple times that people engage with politics on a more routine level than people in the United States, that it forms part of everyday conversations, and people are interested and follow elections and follow politics more than the kind of rational ignorance that characterizes much of the American population. And probably the best example of this is that if you did an accurate random sample public opinion poll asking people in the United States which party is in control of the House of Representatives, typically you will get about 55% of the public will give you the right answer. There are only two possibilities. And so if people flipped a coin, there's probably a 1 in 4 chance that you would get at least 55% of the public with the right answer. That the argument is that compulsory voting, because it forces government and election officials to be more responsive to a broader set of views, that it would likely lead to more egalitarian policies, that it would lead to, by increasing the amount of political equality, the assumption is that that would naturally lead to more equitable policies on taxation, on the social welfare safety net, on the distribution of income and benefits. That it will reduce polarization because there is no incentive to demonize your opponents and try to drive down turnout because it doesn't work. And that it reduces campaign costs because the problem of mobilization becomes one for which the government is responsible. And in the United States, in a typical presidential election, the parties and candidates and outside groups, whether unions or other groups, will spend hundreds of millions of dollars just on what we call GOTV, or get out the vote, efforts to try to inform people, to get people registered, to get people transferred to the, give them transportation to the polls. And those costs essentially go away in a system with compulsory voting, and it would presumably allow, at least in theory, for candidates and campaigns and political parties to spend their time and effort and money informing people and persuading people rather than trying to get their people out and discourage the other side from getting their people out. And we know just from this quick view of turnout in industrialized democracies between 2000 and 2010, there is absolutely no question that compulsory voting leads to significantly higher turnout. And so then the question is, given the costs of low turnout, given the benefits of compulsory voting, why we don't have it in the United States. And so I'm going to spend some time talking about some of the reasons why there are some philosophical objections to, general philosophical objections, before I get to the question of what are the particular and specific elements of politics in the United States that make it less likely. The objection that is often heard in this country: compulsory voting is popular, but it is not universally popular. The polls that I saw when I was here, that typically 70–75% of the public supports it, and that's pretty widespread support. But there are proposals, there are political elites in this country who object to the idea of compulsory voting, based on the fundamental argument that forcing people to participate is not a practice that is consistent with any system that is premised on freedom and individual liberty, and that rather than leading to free and fair elections, forcing people to vote under threat of sanction is not something that the governments that are concerned with individual liberty and freedom ought to do. Even though, as in the practice in Australia, it is not voting that is compulsory, but it is rather the act of putting a ballot into the box. And I can tell you from observing the 2007 parliamentary elections that I would not want my 15-year-old daughter to read the messages that are on a significant percentage of ballots that are submitted by people who object to the practice. They actually, the election officials, when I was at the Fraser division, and they let me take some pictures of the ballots that didn't have any preferences marked on them except a very clear preference against compulsory voting, and it was interesting, to say the least. And the messages were clearly expressed in both words and pictures. That people who vote only because it's compulsory are unlikely to take the time to become fully informed on the issues if their only concern is just getting the vote cast so they don't pay the $20 fine or $50 fine, and it's not a practice that will lead to the kind of informed and deliberative decisions that we would all like in the ideal to characterize decision-making in democratic systems. And if compulsory voting does lead to policy changes, it is because the government is putting its thumb on the scale, implementing a procedure that everybody fully expects that will lead to particular policy outcomes. And that's not really the business of a democratic government, to try to favor one set of policies over the other. So, having gone through this explanation of the benefits and costs and objections, one of the arguments that I heard that's very frequently expressed is that compulsory voting is not a big deal because there are all kinds of examples of compulsory, compelled activities that are either far more serious than compulsory voting and are typically not questioned as a proper practice of even democratic government. So, example, paying taxes is compulsory. You don't have an option to decide, well, I think this year I will pay well, I suppose you could do that, but I would suggest that it's probably not a very good career move. It tends to attract the attention of the authorities. Military service is compulsory in those countries where there is conscription, which was the practice in the United States between certainly World War II and the 1970s. People, you probably didn't know that in the United States that you are actually obligated to complete the census form. That if you don't, you are liable for civil penalties and then what amount to criminal penalties if you refuse to pay the fine. And the one example that is most in common between Australia and the United States is jury duty is compulsory. If you and the patience for people who try to get out of jury duty by claiming that it's a hardship, it's become much more difficult in the United States to do that. And again, these activities require, with the exception of filling out the census form, these activities are far more intrusive and involve far more limitations on individual liberty, and nobody really questions their legitimacy. Although everybody likes to complain about taxes, there were a number of legal challenges in the United States to conscription, but they never got anywhere. So what are some of the objections? I'm going to break this part up into three separate sections to talk about the philosophical objections, those that are unique to the political culture in the United States, some of the practical and administrative issues that can arise or that would arise in the United States, and finally some of the legal objections. And none of these are absolutely conclusive. It I think remains an open question as to whether compulsory voting could be instituted in the United States, but I think it's also true that you could make a similarly serious case that it would not be permitted. So some of the philosophical objections that we see: Australia has a constitution, the United States has a constitution. The Australian constitution is in many respects patterned after the United States Constitution. The structure of the Australian government, bicameral legislature, an independent judiciary, a federal system, those are all things that were either drawn or heavily influenced by the United States experience. And Australia has a constitution, but one of the key differences is that the Australian Constitution is, for the most part, a legitimizing document. There are really only a small number of specific rights that are enumerated, and there are very, very few, if any, specific prohibitions in the Australian Constitution about what the government may not do. What we would call in the United States a manifest of negative liberties. The US Constitution is full of them. In particular, the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, is in almost every respect a lengthy and detailed list of things that the government may not do. The reason for that is that most people in America, and I'm generalizing here, so I apologize if this seems like I'm making sweeping statements, but my sense is, even though you don't like your politicians any more than we like our politicians, although it is also true that I guess, how can I phrase this, that these days you like our politicians a lot more than we like our politicians, which is actually a switch from maybe 5 years ago, that I get the sense that Australians would be more likely to support the statement that government is a benevolent force that is useful in solving problems, and that the purpose of government is to solve problems. And really, it's one of the features of the Westminster system, even though Australia's version of it is a hybrid that exists about halfway between the British system of parliamentary sovereignty and the American system of limited government and a written constitution. You don't see government as a threat or potentially dangerous, when that view is much more common in the United States. Certainly not everybody feels that way, but I think on balance, the people in the US would be far more likely to agree with the statement that government is dangerous and therefore must be specifically limited. And many of the features of American government, the separation of powers, the fixed terms of election, the federal structure. These are all things that were designed by the people who wrote our Constitution as ways of checking the potential abuse of government power. This is where the connection between compulsory voting and guns comes into play, because there is probably no better example of how many people view the Constitution and government through the Second Amendment, which the Supreme Court recently held that the Second Amendment, which provides a well-regulated militia being necessary for the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The Supreme Court has held that protects and creates an individual right to keep and possess weapons, firearms, which most people who believe in a strong Second Amendment see that as a bulwark against intrusive government authority and dictatorship. And that may be an extreme particular manifestation of that belief, but it is a very strong expression of what the more mainstream belief is, that government can be dangerous. And this is true for both liberals and conservatives, even though they disagree on the particular types of threats that they see. For conservatives, and it can be difficult for Australians to understand American politics and vice versa, if for no other reason that your liberals are our conservatives, but you're on the other side of the world. The Coriolis effect, water goes down the drain in the opposite direction, so I find it perfectly easy to understand. Although for those of you who find American politics impenetrable and impossible to understand using a language that you simply cannot comprehend, that's what we feel like when we watch cricket. So one way of thinking about those divisions is that conservatives tend, and again, this is a generalization, conservatives tend to dislike restrictions on property rights and economic rights, regulations on what you can do with your property, a lot of environmental regulations, although a lot of conservatives are okay with laws that have the effect of limiting important social issues like gay marriage and abortion. Liberals, on the other hand, tend to dislike restrictions on social issues like gay marriage and abortion, although they are typically fine with restrictions on economic and property rights. Liberals are more likely to support gun control, environmental regulation. Conservatives would be more likely to support things like strong government surveillance powers to protect against terrorism, when liberals would oppose those. But the point here is that both liberals and conservatives fear intrusive and large and sweeping government powers, even if they disagree on the particular issues that they are concerned about. And it is possible on a philosophical level to distinguish compulsory voting from the other forms of compulsory activity. Taxes are unpleasant. Nobody likes to pay them. We argue over the specifics, but taxes are fundamental to the existence of government. You cannot have government without taxes. And so while in the United States we fight and disagree over who should pay, how much, what the balance of the distribution of the tax burden should be, nobody seriously argues that there should be no taxes. Conscription is no longer the practice in the United States, but when it was the practice, typically it was at the height, World War II, the height of the Cold War, Vietnam, and the reason the courts the reason no court would step in and declare conscription unconstitutional, despite the language of the 13th Amendment, which provides that no slavery or conditions of involuntary servitude would be permitted, is that in a very real sense, when there is conscription, that is often when, in a very real sense, that the survival of the government, the survival of the nation is on the line. Census is not enforced. I did some research into this, and the last example I could find of an individual being fined for refusing to fill out the census form was in 1960. And it was a person in Hawaii who not only refused to fill out the census form, he was quite noisy about it and wound up getting prosecuted, paying a small fine. The more typical response these days is that if you refuse to fill out the census form, the Census Bureau will make a guess about the population in the house and they will fill it out for you. And jury duty, the distinction, and as I see it, the jury duty is a compulsory, the reason people are okay with this as a compulsory obligation is that jury duty is the last check against the power of government, in which a body of citizens, usually 6, in federal trials it can be 12, that it is up to the jury, which is almost completely sovereign. It is virtually impossible to overturn a jury verdict unless there is evidence of misconduct, to put someone in prison in a criminal trial. You have to get you have to have Congress passing a law, you have to have the executive branch enforcing the law, you have to have the judiciary preside over the trial, and you need to get a body of in theory, randomly chosen citizens to agree that you should be put away. And because of that, and because of the status of jury duty as a way of protecting individuals against actions of government, it is different than compulsory voting, which in the US would be something portrayed as an obligation that is imposed simply for the convenience of the people in power. I know that sounds very strange to an Australian audience, but I think that if there were not compulsory voting now and a government tried to impose it, I think the reaction here now would be different than when it was actually implemented in the 1920s. And now, as far as the practical differences, these are figures that come from the parliamentary inquiry or the report to Parliament on the administration of the 2007 parliamentary elections. And this shows the number of people, the apparent number of people who didn't vote, who received a notice from the Australian Electoral Commission, 450,000, about 3.2% of the eligible population, or about 5% of the, these are the number of people who were noticed, not the number of apparent non-voters. Of that 450,000, 289,000 responded with an excuse, which was accepted in 186,000. 59,000 people were assessed a $20 penalty, and 64 people were prosecuted for refusing to pay the penalty. And there's a lot of noise in here because there's lots of evidence that the AEC attempted to contact people and letters were not deliverable. So that's why these numbers don't add up precisely. And it is also the case that compulsory voting is typically that the notices and fines are only assessed if you are already enrolled, what in the States we would call registered, and you fail to show up on election day and there's no evidence that you moved out of the country or died, or one of the other things that outside of Chicago would prevent you from voting. The United States is about 15 to 16 times the size of Australia. Australia is about 22, 23 million people. We are about 325 million people. This is what these numbers would look like in the United States. And this is assuming the same percent of non-compliance, where I think the numbers would actually be significantly higher because of a genetic predisposition among most Americans that we don't like being told by government what to do, especially on an issue like this. So it's possible that these numbers could be 2, 3, 4 times as large. The voting age population in the United States is about 230 million. And so if you get a 10% or a 15% non-compliance rate, you're talking about 23, 33 million people who would need to have enforcement action taken against them. And so these numbers are just a direct extrapolation from the estimates of the voting age population in the United States. You're talking about millions of people, and the actual administrative burden would almost certainly be much higher than this, and you're talking about trying to pursue administrative penalties and action against a population in the tens of millions, which suggests that it would be a very difficult task. Another practical problem is that unlike Australia, in which federal elections are administered by a single agency, the Australian Electoral Commission, in the United States, election administration, even for federal elections, President, House of Representatives, Senate, is universally conducted and actually administered by the states. And usually it trickles down even farther than that, and that the actual on-the-ground administration of elections is typically performed by municipal officials acting at the county or municipal level. Just in the state of Wisconsin, with a voting age population of about 4.5 million, we have almost 2,000 independent election administration officials, which is about a quarter of the election officials in the entire country. This is a consequence of our federal structure, which specifically relegates election administration to the states, with one exception that allows Congress to step in some considerations. So Congress has the authority to regulate what the Constitution refers to as the time, manner, and place of elections. But decisions about voter qualifications, residency requirements, registration requirements, all of those are handled by the states, and it varies from state to state. In Wisconsin, you can register on election day. In other states, you have to register up to 28 days in advance. Some states permit no excuse absentee or mail ballots. Other states don't permit it unless you have an actual reason. And more crucially, there is no single centralized database of registered voters. We have 51 separate sets of registered voters. And I can tell you from observing the process in Wisconsin of every state now is required to create a computerized voter registration database, but it was a monumental task in Wisconsin, as it was in many states, because the way that different states try to keep track of people can be much more difficult and controversial than it is here. And because of this constitutional allocation of election administration authority to the states, there is a constitutional question as to whether Congress would have the authority to implement compulsory voting, overriding any particular state objections to that practice. And it really would not work at all if some states had compulsory voting and other states did not. But at a worst case is that the only way you could practically implement compulsory voting is to get every state in the country to enact compulsory voting. And all I have to say about that, good luck getting that to work in Texas. And you have coordination problems, all manner of difficulty. A second practical problem is that one of the characteristics of Australian elections is, as I noticed when I was in the Fraser division, you have an unusually large percentage of what in the states we would call spoiled ballots, what you call informal ballots, or invalid ballots in the states. In 2010, 5.6% of the ballots in House elections were invalid. And we know, we know from the classification that the AEC makes of these ballots that actually most of these are not the kind of unintentional errors that you might find if someone in the US, we don't have preferential voting or the single transferable vote. All you have to do is register one preference, but people still make mistakes. 29% of the ballots were blank. I submit to you that is not an accident. 17% were the protest ballots that I would not want my daughter to read. 28% had only the first preference recorded with no others, and that might be a protest. It might also be a protest against the requirement that you rank all of the candidates in the House preferential voting system, or that you rank all of the Senate candidates from 1 to however many there are in the single transferable vote. 12% had sequence errors or incomplete numbering. When the AEC investigated this earlier, they did find that these errors were very strongly related to income, education, and English, the percentage of people who spoke English. So it's quite plausible that most of these were not intentional. 12% were marked without numbers. It's possible that these could be intentionally the equivalent of blank or protests, but the percentage of invalid ballots in the US is more in the range of 2 to 2.5%, and a 5 or 6, and the percentage of invalid ballots in Australia had actually been increasing, although in 2010 they went down a little bit. I think in 2007 they were as high as 7%. So in addition to the practical administrative problems, we have a specific set of legal objections, which come from the First Amendment to the Constitution, which reads as follows: Congress shall make no law respecting establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. Now this language is not taken literally. Congress shall make no law does not mean Congress shall make no law. It means that Congress shall make no law unless it has a very, very good reason, because there are all kinds of, even in the context of freedom of speech, which is one of our most highly cherished civil liberties, interpreting this language literally would mean that you couldn't take action against someone for libel, that you couldn't take action for someone for making specific threats. For dishonest commercial speech. There are a lot of classifications of speech that don't have constitutional protection, but what this means in practice when we are talking about political speech, it is very clear jurisprudence from the Supreme Court that just as Congress may not prohibit speech, it may not prohibit you from not speaking. And that means, and this comes from a landmark Supreme Court case in the 1940s where Jehovah's Witnesses refused to say the Pledge of Allegiance because they saw it as a requirement that they worship a graven image. And there were a number of states that required school children to say the Pledge of Allegiance, and the Supreme Court overturned those laws, saying that the First Amendment prohibits the government from mandating agreement or expression of statements or beliefs or symbolic speech that people don't agree to. Government may also not restrict political speech, and again, there are some exceptions, but political speech is one of the most tightly protected classes. What this means is that if non-voting can be characterized as a political act or an act of symbolic expression, you can't prohibit it. And you might be able to finesse it by saying that as long as people don't have to record a preference, all they have to do is submit a ballot. I don't think that solves the constitutional problem. Now, there is some leeway here, which the Supreme Court has held that when government has a sufficiently powerful reason to abridge some of these constitutional rights, whether it's conscription or laws against libel, or as you will often hear in the United States, that the First Amendment does not give you the right to yell fire in a crowded theater. You probably have heard that. That's actually incorrect. What the First Amendment does not protect is the act of falsely yelling fire in a crowded theater. If there actually is a fire, you're good. So the conclusion is, having laid out these difficulties and objections, is that compulsory voting is, in my view, not consistent with American political culture and political traditions. And in that respect, this suspicion of government means that our nation emerged in a process that was very different from Australia. Australia emerged in federation in 1901 as the result of an entirely peaceful process. The American nation was born by kicking the British out at the point of a gun. And that's a significant difference that can tell you a lot about attitudes towards governments. We have a very, very strong constitutional principle of limited government. We have an explicit Bill of Rights, which exists as a set of concrete restrictions on government power. And unlike parliamentary systems, and this is, I'm finessing a little bit because Australia does not necessarily have a tradition of parliamentary sovereignty as you have in Great Britain, but the notion of the government being sovereign in any kind of element in terms of the ultimate authority over its own powers, that is fundamentally inconsistent with how people in the United States view government, where the people are sovereign. And if compulsory voting were ever enacted in the United States, which would be unlikely, but if Congress passed the law and the president signed it, I think there would be large-scale protests and disobedience of the like that probably would make the Civil War draft riots look like a Girl Scout cookie sale. And what would happen in the next election is anybody voted for that would be summarily tossed out. And so that concludes my prepared remarks. I'd be happy to take questions. Okay.